Everyone thought the boy was overreacting until the CEO realized that listening to him saved his life. The restaurant parking lot was almost empty when Marcus Reed stepped outside, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit. As CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, he was used to people staring, but tonight he noticed someone staring differently. A small boy, the boy clutched his mother's hand tightly. She wore a faded diner uniform, her face tired but gentle. As Marcus reached for his car door, the boy suddenly screamed, "Don't get in the car." The sound cut through the air like glass shattering. Conversations stopped. A server dropped a tray. The mother gasped, pulling her son closer. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Eli, stop." But Eli's eyes were locked on Marcus's car, wide, terrified. "There's something wrong," the boy said, shaking. "Please don't." Marcus slowly removed his hand from the door. Angela's tray nearly slipped from her hands as the words echoed through the diner, and for a split second, the clatter of forks and low conversation seemed to fade into a distant hum. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard it hurt, the kind of pain that came from fear rather than surprise. She had seen this look before, the way strangers' eyes shifted, the way shoulders stiffened, the way judgment formed before facts ever did. People were watching now, not just curious glances, but sharp ones. Suspicious ones, the kind that labeled first and asked questions never. Trouble, drama, a problem kid. Her son stood frozen near the table, small fingers curled into the hem of her uniform, eyes wide and terrified yet stubbornly fixed on the man he had warned. Angela felt heat rush to her face, shame and panic tangling in her chest. She moved fast, too fast, instincts screaming at her to shut this down before it turned ugly. "I'll take him away," she said quickly, her voice cracking despite her effort to keep it steady. "He doesn't know what he's saying, he's just a kid." She reached for Eli's arm, already imagining whispers spreading across the diner, imagining the manager's look, imagining the words she had heard too many times before: "Control your child, don't cause a scene, people like you always bring problems." But Marcus didn't wave her off. He didn't laugh. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't do any of the things Angela had braced herself for. Instead, he slowly pushed his chair back and crouched down until he was eye level with Eli, moving with a deliberate calm that made the entire moment feel heavier rather than lighter. The noise in the diner didn't return. It stayed quiet, suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said gently, his voice low and even, not the voice of a man offended or threatened, but of someone genuinely listening. "Can you tell me why?" Eli swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as his grip tightened on his mother's uniform. His eyes darted briefly to Angela, as if asking permission, as if already expecting her to stop him. Angela shook her head slightly, pleading silently for him to stay quiet, to stay safe, but fear had already loosened his words. "I saw the man earlier," Eli whispered, his small voice barely carrying past the table. "He put something under your car. I thought he was fixing it, but he was shaking, and he ran." The words landed like a dropped plate, sharp and unmistakable. Angela felt the blood drain from her face so fast she had to steady herself against the counter. "Under your car, shaking. Ran." Her mind raced through images she didn't want to see, news stories she avoided, dangers she pretended didn't exist, because acknowledging them made it harder to breathe. She pulled Eli closer to her instinctively, wrapping an arm around him as if she could physically shield him from the consequences of speaking up. "That's enough," she said, her voice trembling now despite her best effort to control it. "Please, please don't get him in trouble. He didn't mean anything by it." Her words came out rushed, almost desperate, shaped by years of learning how quickly a situation could spiral when a child said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Marcus slowly rose to his feet, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying second, Angela expected anger, dismissal, maybe even a joke at her expense, something that would make the moment smaller and safer by pretending it didn't matter. But he didn't brush it off. He didn't smile. He didn't reassure her that kids imagine things. Instead, his eyes sharpened, not with fear, but with focus. The kind of focus that made Angela's stomach twist. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, the movement calm, practiced, deliberate. The screen lit up his face for just a moment, and in that glow Angela saw something that made her chest tighten even more than before, not suspicion of her son, but belief, real belief. Around them, the diner seemed to sense the shift. Chairs creaked as people leaned back. A fork clinked against a plate and went untouched. Angela held her breath, every instinct screaming that this had gone too far, that she should have dragged Eli out the second he spoke, that whatever was coming next would not be small or simple. She didn't yet understand what Marcus did, what he knew, or why the way he held that phone felt less like a reaction and more like the beginning of something already trained into him. All she knew was that her son's fear had been real, and now it had been heard. Everyone in the diner expected the moment to deflate. They expected Marcus to chuckle awkwardly, maybe pat the kid on the head, maybe wave it off as a misunderstanding before going back to his meal and his important evening plans. That was how moments like these usually ended, quietly, conveniently, without consequences. But Marcus didn't smile. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't even sit back down. He stepped away from the table, his phone already pressed to his ear, his posture straightening with a gravity that made the air feel heavier. "Yes," he said into the phone, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "I need officers at my location immediately, possible device under my vehicle." A murmur rippled through the diner, confusion spreading from table to table as people processed what they'd just heard. Possible device, under my vehicle. Angela felt her stomach drop, a cold wave of dread washing over her as reality began to crystallize in terrifying detail. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't imagination. Marcus ended the call and turned back to the small gathering of stunned faces. "I'm canceling my meeting," he said flatly, tapping his phone once more. "I'm not moving this car, not until it's checked." His certainty sent a chill through Angela's spine. Outside, the parking lot suddenly felt different, no longer an ordinary stretch of asphalt, but a place where something unseen waited. Minutes crawled by with painful slowness. The diner doors opened and closed as words spread, curiosity pulling people toward the windows. Angela sat rigid in a booth, Eli pressed against her side, her arms wrapped around him as if letting go would allow something terrible to happen. She replayed his words over and over in her head. He was shaking. He ran. How had she almost silenced him? How close had she come to dragging him away, to apologizing for his honesty? The first patrol car arrived with lights flashing but no siren, the officers moving with careful efficiency. Then another. Then a vehicle Angela recognized only from television, dark, heavy, unmistakable. The bomb squad. Her knees buckled when she saw them kneel near the car, mirrors and equipment in hand, their movements precise and deliberate. Eli buried his face into her jacket, and Angela could feel his small body trembling. Every breath she took felt shallow, fragile, as if the world might shatter if she inhaled too deeply. The parking lot fell unnaturally silent, even traffic on the road beyond seeming to fade away. Time stretched thin as the officers worked, their focus absolute. Then one of them slowly stood and looked toward Marcus. His face was serious, stripped of any casual professionalism. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence, "your life was just saved." The words hit like a physical blow. Angela's vision blurred as her knees finally gave way, and she sank back into the booth, her heart pounding so violently she thought she might faint. The officer explained calmly, methodically, as if delivering routine information instead of a nightmare made real. A tracking device had been secured beneath the frame. Attached to it was an explosive trigger, concealed expertly, positioned for maximum damage. It wasn't crude, it wasn't random, it was deliberate, planned. The parking lot felt frozen in time as the weight of it settled over everyone present. Marcus didn't speak right away. He stood perfectly still, staring at the car as if seeing it for the first time, as if realizing how close he had come to never leaving that diner alive. Then he turned slowly toward Eli. His expression softened, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to let something human through. He knelt again, this time with reverence rather than curiosity. "You were right," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You were very brave." Eli looked up, eyes wide, tears clinging to his lashes, and for the first time since speaking, he nodded. Angela covered her mouth as sobs finally broke free, tears streaming down her cheeks unchecked. Relief crashed into fear, guilt tangled with gratitude, and she held her son tighter than she ever had before. Around them, strangers watched in stunned silence, no longer seeing a troublemaking child or an overreacting mother, but a little boy whose courage had stopped something unthinkable. And in that moment, as flashing lights reflected off the diner windows, Angela realized how close the world had come to tragedy, and how a child's fear, spoken aloud, had changed everything. At the police station, the sterile lights hummed softly overhead as Angela sat gripping a paper cup of untouched coffee, her fingers trembling despite her effort to appear composed. The walls felt too white, too clean, as if they were designed to strip away comfort along with secrets. Eli sat beside her, feet dangling from the chair, unusually quiet now that the adrenaline had faded. When the officers finally asked her to explain everything, the words came out slowly at first, then all at once, years of fear spilling free because there was no longer a reason to hide. She told them she was a single mother, that she worked double shifts whenever she could because bills didn't care about exhaustion, and that Eli's father had once been a good man before bad decisions found him. She admitted that her ex had fallen in with the wrong people after losing his job, men who promised fast money and loyalty but delivered only threats and shadows. Recently, strangers had started appearing near the diner, asking casual questions that didn't feel casual at all: what time she worked, when her shift ended, whether she always parked out back. She had brushed it off as coincidence, convincing herself she was being paranoid because acknowledging danger meant admitting how exposed she really was. She never imagined any of it could connect to Marcus, never imagined that whatever her ex had tangled himself into could reach so far, could turn her child into a target simply because he was observant and brave. Marcus stood a few feet away as she spoke, arms crossed, face unreadable but intent, absorbing every detail without interruption. He didn't rush her, didn't soften the truth for her comfort, and somehow that made it easier to continue. When she finished, her voice cracked and she looked down at her hands, ashamed of how close she had come to silencing her son, of how fear had almost cost someone their life. The room felt heavy with unspoken implications. This wasn't random. This wasn't an isolated incident. Whatever had been planted under Marcus's car wasn't meant as a warning, it was meant to end him. The officers exchanged looks, already piecing together threads that stretched beyond the diner and into darker places. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but steady, acknowledging the risk without dramatizing it. Then, without asking permission or seeking approval, he pulled out his phone and stepped aside. Angela expected him to call security again, or a driver, or maybe a public relations advisor. She expected him to focus on himself, because that would have been reasonable. Instead, she heard him say words that made her look up in disbelief. He called his legal team, not to shield himself from liability or headlines, but to protect her and her son. He spoke with quiet authority, explaining the situation plainly, emphasizing urgency over optics. "I want them safe," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Tonight." Those two words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Angela felt something inside her loosen for the first time in years, a knot she hadn't realized she carried every moment of her life. Arrangements were made swiftly, efficiently, the kind of response reserved for people with resources and resolve. Within hours, Angela and Eli were escorted to protective housing, a secure place she never thought she would see from the inside. As the door closed behind them, the silence felt unfamiliar, not the tense silence of waiting for the next problem, but a calm, guarded stillness. Eli climbed into bed without asking if the doors were locked or the windows were covered. Angela lay beside him, staring at the ceiling as exhaustion finally overtook fear. For the first time in years, she didn't rehearse escape plans in her mind or jump at every distant sound. She slept deeply, fully, without fear clawing at her chest, unaware that this night marked the end of one life and the fragile beginning of another, one where truth, though painful, had finally led them somewhere safe. Weeks later, the bell above the diner door chimed in its familiar way, a sound Angela had heard thousands of times without ever expecting it to change her life again. She was mid-pour, steam rising from a fresh pot of coffee, when she looked up and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Marcus stood just inside the doorway, dressed simply now, no entourage, no visible security, just a calm presence that somehow filled the room anyway. Her hand trembled so violently the coffee nearly spilled over the rim. For a brief, irrational moment, fear flashed through her, old instincts refusing to let go, but then recognition settled in, followed by disbelief. He smiled, small and genuine, the smile of someone returning not to be seen, but to see. "I owe you more than thanks," he said quietly as he approached the counter, his voice carrying no expectation, only certainty. Angela struggled to steady herself, setting the pot down before she trusted her hands again. Around them, the diner buzzed as usual, unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding in plain sight. Marcus took the same seat he had that night, the same booth that had once been surrounded by flashing lights and hushed terror. Eli emerged from the back, older somehow in just a few weeks, his eyes widening when he saw Marcus. Instead of fear, there was recognition and something like pride. Marcus didn't rush the moment. He let Angela breathe, let her gather herself, then spoke with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed the words not for effect, but for honesty. He told her that investigations were ongoing, that lives had changed because of what her son had noticed, because of what she had nearly silenced but didn't. He told her that gratitude alone felt hollow, insufficient for the weight of what had been prevented. Then he offered her a job, not as charity, not as a favor, but as an opportunity he believed she had earned. Training, education, a role within his company that would grow with her instead of trapping her in survival mode. A real salary, health insurance, stability that didn't depend on tips or luck or the mercy of strangers. Angela's breath caught as the words settled, each one dismantling years of quiet resignation. She tried to protest, instinctively, the way people do when offered something that feels too big to hold, but Marcus gently shook his head. "This isn't pity," he said firmly, "it's belief." And then he turned to Eli. He spoke of a scholarship fund, created in his name, structured not as a publicity gesture, but as a promise, one that would grow, one that would follow Eli wherever his courage and curiosity took him. "Because heroes should never be ignored," Marcus said, his voice steady, unperformative. Eli shifted on his feet, suddenly shy under the weight of attention, his smile small but sincere. "I just didn't want you to get hurt," he said softly, the simplicity of the truth cutting deeper than any speech ever could. Marcus knelt again, just as he had before, bringing himself down to Eli's level, not out of habit, but out of respect. "And because of you," he replied, meeting the boy's eyes, "a lot of people won't." Angela felt tears blur her vision, not the sharp tears of fear she knew so well, but the aching kind that came from relief and recognition and the fragile hope of something better. Around them, the diner continued its rhythm, unaware that a promise had been made that would ripple far beyond its walls, a promise born not of power, but of listening, and of a child brave enough to speak when it mattered most. Years later, the lights in the auditorium softened as Eli stepped onto the stage, taller now, shoulders squared with a confidence that had been carefully built rather than forced. The applause washed over him in a steady wave, not thunderous, but sincere, the kind that came from people who understood they were witnessing something earned. He adjusted the microphone slightly, hands steady despite the weight of the moment, and accepted the award for young innovators with a quiet grace that surprised even those who knew him well. In the front row, Angela pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her cheeks, no longer embarrassed by them, no longer afraid of what vulnerability might cost her. Every late night, every double shift, every moment of fear she had swallowed to keep moving forward seemed to rise up and finally release their grip. She remembered the diner, the coffee pot trembling in her hands, the way she had almost silenced her son out of fear of judgment. She remembered the police station lights, the protective housing, the first night she slept without fear. And now here he was, the same boy who once clung to her uniform, standing beneath bright lights because he had trusted his instincts and spoken anyway. Beside her sat Marcus Reed, older now, lines etched at the corners of his eyes not by stress alone, but by laughter and responsibility shared. He wasn't here as a CEO tonight, not as a powerful figure or benefactor, but as family. He leaned toward Angela slightly, offering a quiet smile, one that carried years of shared holidays, hard conversations, graduations, and ordinary dinners that mattered more than any headline ever could. The bond between them hadn't been built on contracts or gratitude, but on trust forged in a moment when listening had mattered more than status. Eli spoke briefly, humbly, crediting mentors, teachers, and a mother who never stopped believing in him even when the world felt unsafe. He didn't mention the bomb, or the fear, or the night that changed everything, but it lived quietly beneath every word he said, shaping his choices, guiding his work toward protecting others, toward noticing what people too often ignored. As he stepped back from the podium, applause rising again, Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear this time, but awe. He thought of the parking lot, the device hidden beneath metal and shadow, the decision to stop instead of dismiss, to listen instead of laugh. He thought of how close he had come to never knowing this future, never seeing the ripple of one brave voice echo outward into lives saved, opportunities created, families rebuilt. The boy who had once yelled in a parking lot had changed a man's fate, not by force or heroics, but by honesty. And the man who had listened had changed a family's future, not through power alone, but through responsibility and care. As the ceremony drew to a close and Eli descended the steps, Angela rose to meet him, wrapping her arms around her son, feeling the solid proof of years survived and futures claimed. Marcus joined them, his hand resting lightly on Eli's shoulder, pride quiet but profound. Around them, people chatted, laughed, and planned the evening ahead, unaware of how something so small, a child's warning, a moment of belief, had once stood between tragedy and hope. And in that quiet truth lay the lesson that carried forward, long after applause faded, that sometimes the most powerful choice anyone can make is simply to stop, to listen, and to believe a child.